And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Wednesday at 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about job hunting, starting and running a business, and building wealth. So the whole financial side of life. And this morning I feel a little bit like the UBS's chief economist, whose name I'm going up on, Paul Donovan. Lately, I think he's had laryngitis or something, but he's still doing his podcasts, and my voice sounds a little laryngitis-y. Is that a word? So today I'm going to be talking about an issue from the wealth building side of people making money, and I call it the anti-checklist. So people are, I think, very fond of talking about advice that they hear from people who have become very wealthy, or these different books they read or whatever. And while it's fine, even good, to read and listen and watch these sources, I think one has to be careful about just adopting them for one's own life without giving it some pretty considered thought. Each of us has our individual goals. What looks like success for me probably is different than what success looks like for you. I was in a meeting last week, and I think I talked about this incident, perhaps it was yesterday, but I was in a meeting with someone who's a registered investment advisor. And I've known this person as kind of an acquaintance for a long, long time. And at one point, he was in a business, and it did reasonably well, but it wasn't a business that was probably going to make a lot of money. And so he made a professional switch. Good for him. And now he's an RIA, and he's doing quite well. And he was suggesting certain things that my colleague who set up the meeting and I should do in order to build our businesses. And it was interesting because there was an underlying assumption that we had the same goals as he did. Now, I know my colleague who set up the meeting very well. His and my goals are very similar, but they're not at all aligned. Well, I was just saying that, but they're not nearly as similar as they were with the RIA. And it is interesting that someone who is in the business of figuring out what people's investment goals are made that assumption about me. And so I think there's kind of a blind spot that many of us, perhaps most of us, have, where we make an assumption that everybody is like us, everybody shares our values, everybody has similar goals. That is not the case. For sure, it's not the case. And there's evidence of it all around us, whether it's in the geopolitical sphere or whether it's just in, talking to professional colleagues. Uh, Look, there are people like Elon Musk who are driven to be the wealthiest person in the world. And there are people like me who I have no desire to be the wealthiest person in the world, largely because I'm not interested in making the kind of sacrifices that one needs to make in order to accumulate that kind of wealth. So my interest has always been to live, a better life as an adult than I did as a child, to do work that's meaningful, that helps other people, and to do well enough at that financially that I don't have a lot of financial worries on the one hand, and can engage in doing the things that I like to do, whether it's, wine and spirits like you see on Jiggers's Place, or, buy nice clothing, travel, while at the same time building sufficient wealth for me to sustain that lifestyle when I decide to reduce the amount of time I spend working. I don't think I'll ever stop working. That's not really anything in which I'm interested, because I get a lot of meaning from life. I get a lot of meaning in life from my work. So, and I'm under no illusion that other people share, uh, my perspective on this. And there's nothing magical about my perspective. It's mine. It works for me. But there's no reason why it should work for you or for anybody else in the world. It really depends on the type of life they want to live, right? So there are some wealth building ideas that are out there, and I'm going to challenge 6 of those ideas in today's show, uh, and perhaps give you some food for thought about your own situation as you plot your course, whether you're at the beginning, middle, or more of my age and are much farther along. Okay, so I call this the anti checklist wealth habits. Right? Ooh, what a rebel am I? So you'll hear this. The first one you'll hear about specifically retirement accounts, 401ks, IRAs, etc. Always max out every account, no matter what. In other words, put the maximum amounts allowed by law in your retirement accounts. Now, for some people, that may be true, but for others, it is certainly not the case. So, for example, if you do not already have a so-called rainy day fund, there is no point in your maxing out your retirement accounts, because what is going to happen if there's an emergency and you need money to deal with that emergency? Well, you're going to put it on your credit cards and then pay it off, probably at interest rates that are higher than what you're earning on your retirement account, even after, or not even after, but potentially taking into account the tax savings you may be getting by having funds in a retirement account. Are you going to pull the money out of the retirement account and pay a penalty then? Typically 10%, plus having to pay income tax on the funds withdrawn, depending on the type of retirement account, but potentially paying income taxes. So while in some cases it may be smart to max out your retirement accounts, if you already have an emergency fund set up, if you have sufficient savings, non-retirement savings, that will allow you to make other investments and take advantage of other opportunities. So then at that point, maxing out your retirement accounts may very well make good sense. Okay. But if you're if overfunding your retirement accounts prevents you from taking advantage of other wealth building opportunities, so what you're really doing is you're slowing your wealth building, rather than looking at your finances holistically and making decisions on that basis. So having flexibility oftentimes is more important than maximizing your tax savings. Okay, so it's again, it's an issue to wrestle with. you see this in this is not one of the ones I have on my list here that I made last week, but you see the same thing when talking about paying off debt. People will say, pay off, use every cent you have to pay off debt. Well, I mean, in general, okay, yes, but if you have no savings, what's going to happen when the inevitable emergency comes around? You're just going to build up the debt again. And the other thing you'll hear is, we'll pay off the highest interest rate debt first. No, not necessarily a good strategy. Pay off the smallest debt first. Okay? Because what you want to do is create momentum in paying off your debts. So if you have a smaller debt, even if it's at a lower interest rate, pay it off and get rid of it, and gain a little bit of a feeling of relief, and know what that feels like as a motivation for you to pay off ever more debt. Okay? So always max out every account no matter what. Not a good strategy. It depends on your specific situation, your financial goals. Okay, number 2, diversify at all costs. So diversification certainly is a good investment strategy. However, okay, over diversification can basically guarantee that all you're ever going to get is average returns. So oftentimes, real wealth is built more through concentration than diversification. Okay. So if you look at anyone who's made a lot of money in real estate, what you'll find is their wealth is concentrated in real estate. Okay. Now, they will typically have more than one property. And so you might say, well, that's a form of diversification. And I would agree with that. Okay. But what you're not going to see is someone who is building their wealth through real estate, heavily invested in commodities and stocks and bonds. I mean, they may have some investments in those areas, probably do, as they've built up their wealth in real estate. They will start to diversify away. Okay. But in the early stages of wealth building, they tend to be concentrated. The same is true for someone who's building his wealth through starting and building a business. Most of their wealth is going to be concentrated in that business. So to diversify during a business building phase is going to detract from one's ability to build that business. Okay. So in general, concentration is how wealth is built, while diversification is how it's preserved. So once you've built wealth, then you want to start diversifying it away, or not diversifying it away, diversifying where it's held. So you will see this in founders of companies. Once their company has grown and has hit a certain level of stability, so then at that point, they may, for example, sell some stock in the business, okay, or sell some ownership interests in the business, typically maintaining control themselves. But by selling a partial interest of the business, they can take those funds and put them in other types of investments and gain some diversification. But notice that the business has to be worth a significant amount of money and present an investment opportunity to outsiders in order to be able to execute that strategy. Okay, so again, concentration is typically how wealth is built. Diversification is how it's preserved. So know the difference between being in the building phase and the protecting phase. Those are two different times in our lives, and they do overlap, of course, but we don't want to retard the building phase by moving into the protecting phase too early. Okay, next, buy assets, never liabilities, or another way people put it is never borrow money, never take on debt. Okay, that is not a good strategy at all. There are some excellent reasons to take on debt. Let's start with the reasons not to take it on. Okay. Don't take on debt to buy the basics of life. I mean, unless you have to. Okay, you're unemployed, you're working on getting another job. Unemployment insurance is not, paying enough for you to pay your rent and your food and your insurance, car expenses or whatever. Okay, of course, then you're going to use your credit cards to buy those kind of things. But if you're working, okay, or you have an income, you have a business and it's generating income, you should not be using your credit cards to buy food, pay for your housing, pay for your car expense. Now, you can use the credit card, but pay it off every month. Don't build up a credit card balance to buy those things. Don't use credit cards to buy clothing. Okay. In general, credit cards are a great tool, but when they're paid off at the end of each month or at the end of each, period. Okay. So you don't want to accumulate credit card debt in general. Now, there are even some times when incurring credit card debt can be a good idea. Let's say you have an investment opportunity that has the potential for a very high yield. So in that case, it may make sense to use money drawn from a credit card to make that investment, and you can leverage what using debt is. When you buy an investment, you're leveraging the person of that in the purchase of that investment. I did a show on leverage probably about a year or more ago. So I invite you to go to my YouTube channel and search out the show on leverage. I talk about neutral leverage, positive leverage, and negative leverage. Okay. So leverage as a term simply means borrowing money to buy something. You want the leverage to be positive, meaning that the return on the investment is higher than the cost of the borrowed money. If you can do that, borrowing money typically will be a sensible thing to do, because by borrowing money, you can get a larger investment, and the leverage gives you a higher return on the cash portion that you put in to buy that investment. Okay, that's the essence of leverage. Okay, so we can talk about, but we can also talk about incurring debt for other reasons. So maybe you're building a business. That can be a perfectly good reason to take on debt, especially if it means that you can own the entire business. You don't have to give up a share of the equity in the business. Okay, so if you can borrow in a way that will still allow you to build the business and build it to a strong position, by all means, borrow to start and run that business. Okay. Um, a more difficult topic is, should you borrow to build your education? So the sort of common wisdom used to be borrowing for an education is a smart thing to do. I don't think that's the case anymore. First of all, so often, let me say, um, these days, so many companies do not require a college education. And I'm not talking about the Lowe's and those kind of businesses. I'm talking about companies like E&Y, Alphabet. There are a number of large companies and ever more large companies that do not require people to necessarily have a college degree. One of my closest friends, who does extremely well in the technology sector, does not have a college degree. Okay? He wasn't interested in going to college. He's self-taught, and he's done very well over his career. Okay. And he was doing very well, but at a time before a lot of companies were realizing we don't really need people to have degrees. Okay. So even to borrow money to become a lawyer. Well, economic times for lawyers are not what they are not today what they were 20 years ago. Same thing for doctors. Medicine is not nearly the lucrative opportunity that it was 20 or 30 years ago. The whole business of medicine has changed. So I think we have to be very careful about borrowing money to enhance our education. So people think, oh, if I get an MBA, that's really going to help me. Well, maybe it depends what you want to do. Okay. So again, there are good reasons to borrow money. If you want to buy a house, that's a fine reason to borrow money. Okay. You're probably not going to be able to save up the money to pay for a house in cash in any event. Okay. And at least right now, the tax laws are favorable for borrowing money to buy a house. So by all means, get a mortgage when you buy a house. Okay. Now, should you borrow money when you buy a car? Well, maybe if you can't otherwise afford a car, then you're probably going to have to borrow money to buy a car. Okay. Should you put money down? Should you borrow 100% of it? Should you lease a car, which is just another form of borrowing money to own a car? Or, well, in this case, you don't really own a car, but you have use of a car under a car lease. Well, those are all options that you should investigate and figure out which one works best for you and your financial situation and your financial goals. Okay, so when we talk about borrowing money, one of the reasons why so many financial gurus are opposed to borrowing money is because they're opposed to negative cash flow. But I can tell you, as someone who has been in the real estate business for a long, long time, there are properties that are worth buying that have a negative cash flow. Okay. And if it's something that you're going to be able to buy the property, and when you close on the purchase of that property, you have a negative cash flow, but you're going to be able to renovate the property. Maybe it's an apartment building. You're going to fix up the units, and that will allow you to raise the rents. And so the negative cash flow is going to be somewhat temporary while you spend whatever it takes, 3, 6, 9, 12 months to refurbish the building and re-rent the units. And now, once you've done that, maybe you'll have a great positive cash flow. Okay. So even a negative cash flow that may come because you've borrowed money to buy a property, that itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the specific investment, the opportunity with that investment, and your ability to see a plan through to enhance the best investment and make it a non-negative cash flow investment. Right? This is why owning vacant land, generally speaking, is a poor investment. Unless you've got a plan to in the short term, develop that land and make it income producing, or let's say you're going to develop houses on it and turn around and sell the houses. Owning vacant land for long periods of time, the value of the land has to increase enough each year, not only to cover your costs of holding that land, which may be property taxes, insurance, there may be some maintenance costs. Okay. It must also increase fast enough to give you a return on your investment. Okay. And if you've borrowed money to buy that vacant land, so it's got to cover the cost of making those loan payments as well. Now, again, it may be a perfectly good investment. You may buy a parcel of land, and your plan is over the next 2 years, you're going to subdivide that land into individual lots on which developers can build houses. And you can buy the land so cheaply that 2 years later, when you sell the lots, despite the negative cash flow you've had for the last 2 years, you may still make a very nice profit. Well, so then there you go. So the negative cash flow isn't a downside. So the idea that you should never never buy liabilities isn't a good strategy in that case. Okay, so context matters more than habits. Okay, let's take a quick break and we'll come back for some more. When life brings unexpected changes, managing inherited property shouldn't add to your stress. Magnum Properties specializes in probate and trust real estate management. We handle the complexities while you focus on what matters most. From property maintenance to tenant relations, from legal compliance to maximizing value, we're your trusted partner through every step. Magnum Properties Inc., turning property challenges into peace of mind. Call us today at 213 264 4396 or visit magnumprops.com. Okay, so next, you hear this again, typically from financial advisors, not so much RIAs, they tend to be more sophisticated, but for the sort of entry level financial advisors, they'll say, look, set up a plan where every week, I mean, not every week, every month or every paycheck, some money is automatically deducted from your paycheck to go into some kind of ETF or mutual fund. Just set it and forget it. You've probably heard that before. Set it and forget it. So, I mean, the problem with that is that it's substituting what amounts to passive neglect for passive investing. Okay, so ETFs and mutual funds, they can be fine investments. Okay, you can do very well with those. They may make a lot of sense, for example, for your retirement accounts, but they should be reviewed periodically. I would say at least a minimum of once a year, maybe more often, depending on how much money you have and what's going on in your life, what's kind of happening in the economy. Okay, you don't need to be obsessing on them and checking them every day. That doesn't make any sense either. But the idea that you should just set it and forget it, and 20 years later, you'll look at it and this nest egg will have blossomed. No, that is not a good plan either. So part of a smart investing strategy is to set up periodic times when you will review how that strategy is working. Okay. And like I said, once a year may be enough. However, maybe you got married. So maybe you need to review your investment strategy, or maybe you and your spouse need to look at how are we going to combine our investing strategies so that we're working together as a couple as opposed to two individuals. Maybe you just had a child. How is that going to impact your investment strategy? Okay. Now maybe you need to be thinking about, I don't know, putting money aside so the child can go to college, or maybe they're going to want to go to a technical school, culinary school, something like that. Or maybe you're going to set aside some money so that when they get done with high school, maybe they don't want to go to college, but they're going to want to start a business, and you want to be able to give them a little nest egg that will give them some capital with which to start that business. All of those necessitate keeping an eye on your investments periodically and at crucial times in your life to make sure that your investing goals are on track with what's actually happening with your money. Okay, so tax law changes, that's another reason to review your investments, even if you are just doing automatic monthly or every paycheck investments or something like that. Okay, because tax laws do change, and taxation has an impact on investment growth. This is true, by the way, not just for your non-retirement investments, but for your retirement investments as well. Okay, over time, while you may start out with your retirement investments in a much more aggressive posture, as time goes by, okay, you may want to change that posture to something more neutral, so that you shift from a growth mode to more of a maintenance mode. Okay, and then as you're getting very much closer to retirement, or retirement is, maybe a few years away. Okay, again, that may necessitate a change in your investment posture as well. Okay, so you can't just set investments and forget them. They need to be periodically reviewed, probably best with your investment advisor. Now, maybe you have enough knowledge on your own, so you don't need advice. Okay, fine. But if you're not taking the time to be well versed in the financial markets and different types of investments, and how the economy is going and all of that, you'd be well advised to have an investment advisor who can help you out with those periodic reviews. Okay, that was number 4. Number 5, live like you're broke forever. So a lot of people take this message from Warren Buffett, who, given the amount of his wealth, lived a fairly modest life compared to other people with similar wealth, and they look and they go, well, so you should do what Warren Buffett does. Well, first of all, Warren Buffett flies chartered jet flights whenever he travels. Evidently, that's his one perk. So, I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we exactly look at, living the life of someone like a Warren Buffett. Okay. But more importantly, we shouldn't pattern our life off of the lives of other people who have different experiences, different wants, different needs, different goals. Okay. Now, you may say, well, but my goals are exactly like Warren Buffett's. Oh, okay. All right. Well, then maybe you should attempt to replicate exactly what Warren Buffett did. The challenge you have is the economy when Warren Buffett started is very different than it is now. Okay. First of all, the rapidity at which change happens is much greater today than it was, half a century ago. Okay. There weren't anything like the variety of types of investment opportunities then as there are now. For example, there was no such thing as ETFs. There was no such things as crypto. There was private credit, but private credit today is a much more robust market than it was half a century ago. Okay. 50 years ago, we still talked about stockbrokers. You almost never hear that term today, because what stockbrokers did is they looked for kind of the next hot stock, and then they tried to convince people to invest in that stock. You don't really see that anymore. What you have, stockbrokers have become investment advisors, or RIAs, where they're really focused on helping people build wealth as opposed to making a killing on a particular stock. So the whole, and they're, the industry sectors today are much different than they were a half a century ago. Okay. And what the future bodes with new technologies, be it the internet, which again, 50 years ago didn't exist, with artificial intelligence, large language models, automation and such. What is that going to mean? So it's not that the economy wasn't changing and dynamic a half a century ago. It was. But again, the rapidity today is greater, and the volume of information today is greater. And so what it takes to stay on top of things is much more demanding. And so to suggest that we should live the kind of life that someone decided to live 50 years ago may not make any sense. What we do want to do is live the life that we want within the means that we have. Okay, that's different than living broke all the time. Now, if we're broke, we should be living like we're broke because we are, right? However, as our income increases and as our wealth increases, so our lifestyle can grow as well. Now, I did an episode a few months ago, I think, on lifestyle creep, and again, on this topic, I recommend you go take a look at that episode because it talks about some of these issues. But we don't need to live like monks. So deprivation oftentimes will lead to burnout and bad decisions. It can make us angry, like, what am I working so hard for? Those kinds of things. So, what we want to do is strategically employ our resources with an eye toward the long term. Okay. So, it may be perfectly appropriate to take a nice vacation. It affords you relaxation, gives you a change of perspective. All of that can be very beneficial so that when you go back to work, you do so with a fresh mind, a fresh outlook, and you're more productive. So that time off can actually be the most productive time that you spend. So there was a real estate sales expert by the name of Tommy Hopkins. And his philosophy was do the most productive thing at any moment. And when you hear that, you think I should be working all the time. But I was fortunate enough to go to one of Tommy Hopkins's trainings, so I feel I can call him Tommy. So Tommy followed that up by saying sometimes the most productive thing you can do is not work, right? Take that downtime. So, to use some of your income to take some downtime, which someone who's broke may not really be able to do, can be perfectly appropriate. And in fact, may be the best decision because it will allow you to go on and reach, higher, larger financial goals, a higher level of wealth. Okay. So, quality of life spending can increase your earning capacity. All right. So, let's say that, you don't enjoy cleaning your house. Okay. And not only does cleaning your house take time, but it makes you grumpy. Well, so you may be better off paying someone to clean your house. And that way you can feel like you're treating yourself, giving yourself a little bit of a quality of life on the one hand. And on the other hand, you've freed up time maybe that you could spend working on your business or maybe spending more time at your job or developing some kind of side hustle, something like that. All of those are options to consider rather than trying to maximize your wealth by living broke all the time. Okay. Finally, and this is, I've sort of alluded to this throughout today's show. Follow what worked for millionaires. Well, the problem with that is there's a certain survivorship bias that distorts most success stories. So, as much as a number of these people who have become very wealthy and they turn around, they're going to explain to you how they got wealthy. Oftentimes, it appears much more linear in how they're explaining it than it was when they were going through it. That's number one. Number two, the context in which they built their wealth is very different, right? So I mentioned Tommy Hopkins a minute ago. So Tommy Hopkins was very successful in the real estate business in the 1970s. Now, in the and here in California, I believe it was in Orange County, if memory serves. So here's the thing: when Tommy Hopkins was active in real estate, the California Association of Realtors contract for buying a home was 2 to 4 letter size pages long. The contract today for buying a house is, I think, something like 20 to 30 legal size pages long. That's how much more complex things are today, how much more highly regulated things are today. That's not to say that becoming a real estate agent isn't a good way to, build a large income and build wealth. It is, but it's not the same as it was for Tommy Hopkins when he did it. Now, I will say that he keeps. I don't know if he's still doing training, but certainly when I took his training, he was aware of the kind of changes that had happened in the real estate market. Okay, so this is not to knock any particular trainer. The good ones recognize how things have changed, and they help people identify what are the core issues with which they're going to have to deal in order to follow a path similar to the one that they followed. Okay, but be we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that we can do exactly what this person did and get the same result. That it just doesn't work that way. Okay, there are too many variables, including the very basic one of we are not that person building wealth at the time that that person was building wealth. Okay, so be careful in listening to how other people built wealth and being seduced into what the sort of seeming linearness linearity of their stories, the sort of sense of certainty that they may project. It's very likely it was not linear, and they were probably not nearly as certain about the outcome as they are now, having achieved that outcome. Okay, and the second thing is, their path may not be compatible with your skills, your timeline, your risk tolerance. Okay, again, those are individual issues, and they do not necessarily align. And so then what that millionaire may be explaining or teaching won't necessarily fit with your perspective. So the fact of the matter is, and this is kind of the concluding idea I want to share with you, is wealth habits have to fit the person, not the headlines, not the sort of checklist of wealth habits. Okay, it needs to be an individual plan. Certainly watch shows like mine, of course, right? Watch other podcasts, listen to them, read books, listen to the business and economic news, and learn and grow in your ability in this regard. But be wary of any kind of advice that says always do this or never do this. Rarely is that the case. There are almost always exceptions. And the wealth habits that will work the best for you are the ones that come from your having an honest discussion with yourself. If you have a spouse, your spouse, and your wealth advisor or advisors about the kind of life you want to have, the kind of risk you're willing to take, the sacrifices you're willing to make, and then build a plan specific to you, tailored to you. So, those are my thoughts today on the anti checklist wealth habits. And if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, my links to my social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts on YouTube. If you're watching this on Spotify or Apple Podcast and you liked it, please leave a review. I would really appreciate that. And if you're not a subscriber to my YouTube channel, again, would really appreciate having you be a subscriber, and that way you'll know anytime that a new show is going live and or posts on my channel. So you'll be able to know about all the various Way to Wow shows that I'm doing. So I thank you very much for joining me today. And let's see. Tomorrow is my every other Thursday show, Jiggers' Place. We'll have a cocktail and a schmooze. So one more chance to be together this week, and then full slate of shows next week. Again, thank you very much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.